Welcome to Discussion Board 9 with George Herbert, led by myself, Jake Knowles, Carly Claybrink, and Gunnar Wells, the members that all participated in our Group 7. I hope you have a fun time, and I hope that this adequately expresses our thoughts and views on Herbert's poetry. Enjoy! Hello, and welcome to British Literature here to the 1800s. Today we're going to be talking about, for Discussion Board 9, George Herbert, one of my personal favorite poets from the time periods, because George Herbert himself was very religious, whereas I am not very much so at all, which is one thing to really say, because George Herbert still connects to me in a way and shows me a love of his God that I don't personally feel, yet he can still express it. To better understand this, we're going to be looking at George Herbert's poem, The Caller, and secondly his poem, Love 3. So let's have at it. First up, The Caller. And we're moving on to point 1 with a little collar there to show you what's happening. Bad joke, but still accurate, as you'll soon discover. Because as we're going to be looking at the dramatic situation and the symbolic meanings within the collar to help discern exactly what George Herbert is getting at. Now first we have to describe the dramatic situation. We got to pay special care in describing the speaker, how the speaker relates to God, because this is a religious poem, and George Herbert himself always had some sort of religious element in most of his poetry. And so the first thing is we have to understand that dramatically what is happening is that the speaker is angry, very angry at specifically himself or God. It's hard to tell at first until we get into the fact that he's angry at his position in life. He is serving God, but he feels as if he is demeaned, as if he is a servant, so he is striking out, acting more and more animalistic, and then until finally he's just raged so much that God calls out to him, and he says, "Child," where the speaker responds, "My Lord," to reveal it is God, showing that the feelings of servitude that he had are not entirely correct for how he believes God views him as a servant. And this is very important because this is a much more symbolic poem than it is a literal sense of what's happening. It's more about the questioning that's going on inside the poet's head, which is really important because that's where a lot of the meaning comes from on this one. Okay, point 2. Like I said, a lot of symbolic meaning. Here's the first instance of it that we really get to see, is that from the point of a religious person and a cleric of the church, we see George Herbert use the word fruit in line 17. But the thing is, what kind of fruit? Now, the members of my group have discussed and debated as to whether the word fruit is really talking about bearing fruit, some sort of reward or result that the poet is not seeing from the good actions, and is questioning whether or not there is any reward from serving God or being a servant. Whereas fruitlessness would be doing bad actions and receiving nothing. But the real question is, how is this religious inherently? How is this fruit still connected? Because poets love their double meanings in this time period. They love for a word to mean more than just that one or maybe even two meanings of the word. But here we get that, and we also get the aforementioned fruit in the Bible, which is the one eaten by Adam and Eve, the original sin. And in line 17 it even refers to as punishment for the fruit. Therefore, helping allude to the fact that this fruit is the fruit of knowledge that Adam and Eve ate, and humanity is punished for it. This is an old Christian and Bible teaching that basically all of the sin of humanity, the original sin that we all carry with us, is that eating of the fruit of knowledge and the disobeying of God. Therefore, he is questioning why should he be punished for a sin so long ago, and why should he be a servant for something he didn't necessarily do. And this is a big part of the questioning and the reasoning as to how God could exactly treat us so well and not make us subservient and totally like animals to him. And this is a large part of the reasoning behind his eventual conclusion with this poem, which we're getting closer and closer to, moving on to point 3. Finally, we get to point 3, which explains why a little old dog collar here is actually a pretty decent representation of what Herbert's talking about. Because the name, the collar of the poem, it's very important to understand that he could have used any other kind of trapping device. All the things he used in the poem, rope and other devices like that, of sand. Bleh. Finally, we get to point 3, where we see the reason that the collar here is a pretty good representation of what Herbert's talking about. Because Herbert could have used any other kind of binding device, fetters, chains, some sort of other thing, maybe some sort of tighter rope, but all the things he uses are pretty light bondage material because they're mostly things that are self-inflicted, and that's the point. The collar is something you put on an animal or a dog that they could take off or could cast off themselves, but they're working for you. They're, in the human sense, allowing the collar to be put on. They're allowing this servitude, just as he is allowing himself the servitude under God. And that's the thing, is the worst thing Herbert sees about this punishment and this servitude is that it's self-inflicted under his belief of God. And so, in that sense, the title sort of matches up with the thematic content that he's questioning how God views him. And some of the stuff where he says a lot of the animalistic things, like he grew more wild or he grew more fierce, a lot like an animal would. An animal, a work animal who wears a collar. He feels as if he's being degraded because of his servitude and because of what he must be without seeing reward. And the thing is, this collar is self-inflicted because he is serving himself. He could take it off, he could not bear this yoke of servitude, but he does, and now he's finally questioning why he must do this and why God sees us as lesser. But then we get to the main paradox. The central paradox is that we, as servants of God in the poem, are not seen entirely as a servant should be, because the master that he has described, the God he's described, would not call him child. He would not refer to him as anything less than the animal that he supposedly should be according to his bindings. But this God calls him child, and he responds, "My Lord." This is very important because it proves that in Herbert's mind, the God that he loves, and the God that loves him back as a father, and he has servitude as a child to a father, not as an animal to something else. And whereas he acted more animalistic and his pride took part, his arrogant assumptions that he should not be an animal or should not be in service is destroyed, as he sees it is a sign of respect, and he sees it is a sign of childrenhood under his Lord, and that the connection is really much stronger and much more bonding than the one originally thought. The paradox in itself is that the Lord he is described is not the Lord that he actually discovers. And this helps us move into his second poem, Love 3, which further expands and ends the idea of what Herbert thinks of his love of God, his servitude of God, and God's love towards us. And here we come to the very last poem in George Herbert's collection, The Temple. We get Love 3, the conclusion after the collar. Love 3 itself is a love of God, and the actual true love that Herbert has discovered at the end of the collar further explained. So what's actually happening, first off? The dramatic situation is, of course, George Herbert himself, the poet, in essence, is speaking to one that he calls Love, who is trying to let him in, bring him in for a feast, and reward him. But you'll notice that in the poem he also says, "My Lord," and many references that basically explain that this love is the Abrahamic God that George Herbert is under, the Christianic God. It could be Christ, it could be God, but then again, we've seen before that a lot of this poetry refers to God as the three-person God, aka the Holy Trinity. So it's kind of hard to describe, but we still get the fact that Herbert is referring to this person as love. Love itself is letting Herbert in, because God, in Herbert's mind, encompasses all, and encompasses that very love that he has for humanity and for Herbert. And so here's the deal. Love's inviting him in, but Herbert doesn't think he's worthy enough. He doesn't think he's clean. He thinks that his own sin should keep him from seeing this very love and this holy thing because he has questioned it so much and he has denied all those things. Even as a person who's acting as good, which love points out, he has made him and he has done good, but even though there's flaw in him, these flaws he has made and has designed for the purpose of questioning. And then eventually Herbert agrees after he has convinced him, and he sits down, and it's very important, the very last line says that Herbert sat and he ate at the table with Love, or at Love's table. It's a little bit ambiguous as to that part, but that doesn't really matter because it's important that he sat and he ate. And I'll tell you why in the very next question, which is extremely important because it defines the entire meaning of why Herbert ended this poem with Love 3 and why Herbert cares very much for this love of God and why this is the thing he's ultimately trying to express in the temple. And now we come to the final conclusion. Love 3's real meaning behind that dramatic situation and the thematic resolution that comes at the end of that. Because it's very important to realize what Herbert's doing is sitting and eating at the table of love, the person he's called God. This is, as we've described Herbert before, very religious and very in tone religious. So what is it addressing? The final religious point that Herbert wants to express about God and God's love for all of the people, including Herbert himself. Even though he has questioned in the collar and he has raged and he has committed what he sees as himself the sin of pride. But Love still invites him in and Love still reasons and expresses with him. So why does Herbert end the poem this way? Why does he end the entire temple collection this way? And the answer my group has discussed has basically been that Herbert's final message is that it's okay to question God and it's okay to go on your own journey for God in this. And that is the genius of Herbert, is because even me as a non-religious person can see that Herbert's saying is basically you have to find your own way and you have to question. It's okay to question what you think and believe, and that in the end, his God loves you regardless. His God loves you as long as there is love and as long as you are still a servant with love. He loves you regardless. And that's the thing about his view of God. It's very beautiful. It's very pure because even though he knows he has sinned and he thinks he's not worthy, his God still believes he is worthy enough to be redeemed and to sit and eat with him. And the sitting and eating is very, very important because it doesn't matter what he's eating, it matters the fact that he is. Because the thing is, the whole part of the collar was that he saw no reward, no fruit to bear. And the thing is, he's now seeing that fruit. He is now eating. He is being rewarded for his love of God and his servitude. And in a way, Herbert is showing that when one finally travels and questions all these things, whether they feel worthy or not, their love of God will still reward them. And their love of God will reward back. That basically, there is reward in being faithful for those who are faithful. And that's the thing. Herbert himself has expressed to me, someone who's not very religious, a view I can still understand. A view that I can look at and get and think, that's absolutely beautiful. I don't agree entirely, but it's beautiful. It's something that, and he's dead. He's been gone for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's just amazing to think that George Herbert himself has managed to express this. And very promptly he's put it at the very end of his poem because that's supposed to be his final big message, is that the love of God is rewarding and you can find your own journey to it, and that's important, but in the end he still loves you. It is a message of love in the end. That's what he wants to conclude the temple with, because the temple is a message of discovery of God and religion, and in the end that discovery is love. And it's one of the main reasons that George Herbert's big love of God lasted so long, and why his idea that a love of God over romantic love is one that is held true in a lot of church poetry and a lot of religious poetry overall. I, for one, think he's an amazing poet, and think that this sort of look into his life and this sort of analysis proves that George Herbert himself was an amazing poet and always will be, even if he's a little underrated. So with that, that concludes Love 3 and the Collar, and the discussion of George Herbert. And with that, that concludes discussion board 9 on our look into George Herbert. Any more questions or comments, put them right down below. And Sorry about the crappy quality of some of this. This is old rig camera. Not exactly perfect, but I hope that I've adequately expressed my love of George Herbert and everything else to you, and that I've pleased my group with this video. Have a good day and a good life. Sincerely, Jake Knowles.